Welcome to the Level 2 training module for Appendix E, Materials Recovery, which explains the fundamentals of this section in greater detail. While the intention of this training module is to increase understanding of R2 requirements, it is not intended to be used as a standalone guide. For the official text of all R2 requirements, download the R2v3 standard from the SERI website. In addition to the mandatory R2 core requirements covered in Section 1 of the R2v3 standard, Section 2 of the standard details the R2 process requirements in Appendices A through E. The process requirements relate to specific R2 activities that often require specialized processes and expertise to undertake. Because not all R2 facilities engage or specialize in the same activities, the process requirements in the standard apply only to those facilities that undertake the activities covered under each appendix. Appendix E details the additional environmental, health, and safety requirements for facilities engaged in the materials recovery process. These requirements apply to all R2 facilities that undertake any variety of destructive dismantling and separation processes for the purpose of material separation and recovery, whether manual dismantling, mechanical processing, or any other method of separation and recovery. There are a variety of processes that could be included under materials recovery, including chemical processing, thermal treatment, shredding, crushing, manual dismantling, or any other destructive process involving activities such as breaking, cutting, smashing, or prying. Also, materials recovery can apply to facilities processing whole electronic devices, as well as components or individual material streams such as CRT tubes, circuit boards, and batteries. Due to the nature of the materials recovery process, there are increased environmental, health, and safety risks associated with these types of operations, which are addressed in this appendix. It's important to note that there are some specific processing activities where Appendix E, Materials Recovery Certification, is not required. First, any non-destructive demanufacturing, parts harvesting, and repair processes where intact parts or components are removed or disassembled are not considered materials recovery and do not require certification under Appendix E. Second, Appendix E does not apply to use of dedicated self-contained hard drive shredders, chip crushers, hard drive presses, etc., that are used for the purpose of data destruction under Appendix B or Core Requirement 7. The general principle for Appendix E is to maintain processes for the recovery of materials for recycling and the proper management of focus materials in the process of recovery. Let's take a look at the additional process controls required for materials recovery operations. Appendix E begins with a number of requirements related to the protection of workers and the environment. This section builds upon the EHS requirements defined in Core Requirement 3, with enhanced requirements for hazard identification and assessment to address the higher risk of materials recovery operations. To start, the R2 facility must have a regular hazards identification and assessment, conducted by an individual who's trained in risk assessment and analysis. This individual must also be knowledgeable of the hazards associated with the materials recovery activities. The hazard identification and assessment results must be included as part of the documented EHS management system to ensure controls are implemented to manage the identified risks. Especially when operating a mechanical separation process, there can be a variety of associated risks which must be evaluated, at least annually. There are a number of EHS control measures identified in Appendix E that are used by materials recovery facilities to control contaminants in the facility and reduce potential exposures. These measures include cleaning and hygiene controls, equipment and machine safety practices, and exposure monitoring activities. Each of the identified control measures must be considered as part of the hazard identification and assessment. This determines the applicability of the specific processing activities undertaken by the facility. And where the control measures are deemed necessary, the assessment must determine the degree to which the controls must be implemented to ensure effective control of the identified risks. Cleaning and hygiene controls can begin with the establishment of clean areas for eating and drinking that are separate from processing or other areas that may contain contaminants. There should also be a transition area with wash facilities for workers to decontaminate prior to entering the clean areas. If eating or drinking is allowed in a materials recovery area, then regular industrial hygiene testing must be conducted to demonstrate there's no risk of exposure to contaminants. There should also be procedures in place for the cleaning and care of any personal protective equipment used. And in instances where workers wear the same work clothing and shoes home, there must be regular industrial hygiene testing to demonstrate there's no risk of contamination from the work clothing. Cleaning and care activities can also extend to work areas and processing equipment as well. This can include procedures for regularly cleaning the equipment in work areas to remove any contaminants, particularly those related to the focus materials being processed. It's important for the R2 facility to regularly assess the applicability of all cleaning and hygiene control measures in relation to its operations and to determine the degree to which each must be applied in order to manage any change in risks. EHS control measures can also be a part of various equipment and machine safety practices. These would typically include planned safety inspections prior to the use of any equipment, as well as ensuring that physical safety guards are in place to prevent access to any machine hazards and to protect the workers from any outputs, such as flying debris. When any equipment is being cleaned, inspected, serviced, or any other activities where a worker can be exposed to a hazard, it must be completely de-energized to prevent it from operating. The energy sources to the equipment must also be locked out to prevent the equipment from restarting while the worker may be exposed to the hazards. These controls must be defined in equipment-specific lockout procedures, as well as in worker training programs. Overall, the R2 facility must assess the applicability of all equipment and machine safety practices in relation to its operations, and determine the degree to which each control must be applied in order to manage the related risks. Even with robust EHS controls in place, there's a need for workplace monitoring and sampling programs to test the controls and verify their effectiveness. A formal industrial hygiene monitoring program should be established to measure noise levels, air contaminants, and surface contamination. The results of the sampling from these hygiene monitoring programs can be used to monitor trends and determine if additional control measures may be required. It's also important to note that for facilities conducting materials recovery where electronic equipment with fluorescent lamps is dismantled or lamps are removed, a periodic air quality test for mercury is required. Another type of monitoring program that may be required is medical monitoring of workers. Medical monitoring may be particularly necessary for workers exposed to lead or mercury or operations that can generate those contaminants. A medical monitoring program can be used to determine if workers had any previous exposure to a contaminant, as well as to identify any cumulative exposure over time. Regardless of the EHS controls that the R2 facility maintains, it must assess the need for monitoring and sampling programs to identify any possible contaminants, as well as any changes or trends in possible exposure. Monitoring and sampling are also very useful tools to demonstrate the effectiveness of the control programs, so they should be part of the EHS program where there's a potential for exposure. Now let's cover specific requirements related to the removal of FMs. Generally, focus materials and print cartridges must be removed from equipment for proper handling and recovery prior to shredding or any other materials recovery activities. There are certain conditions in which FMs may not require removal. Specifically, if the workers are protected from the risk of the contaminant, the process meets all applicable legal requirements, and it effectively recovers the FM. R2 facilities that are involved in the removal of FMs must ensure that disassembly areas are properly equipped to minimize the risk of accidents or exposures during the process. This can include the proper segregation of damaged or swollen batteries, as well as responding to unplanned incidents such as containing and controlling a smoldering or ignited battery. R2 facilities that recover focus materials must send the items to processing, recovery, or treatment facilities that meet all legal requirements to handle those materials. Specifically, for items containing mercury, such as mercury-containing lamps, they cannot be incinerated and must be directed to mercury retorting or another legal method of recovery. Circuit boards must be directed to processing for metals recovery, and PCBs must be directed to a legally permitted process for the destruction or disposal of PCBs. Any R2 facility that is involved in materials recovery activities must maintain pollution liability insurance or other financial guarantees to cover any potential environmental incidents related to the materials recovery operations. Once equipment or materials have undergone the materials recovery process, any material streams that are generated through the process must be reassessed in accordance with the R2 equipment categorization document to determine the appropriate categorization and any next steps in R2 processing. To summarize, the requirements of Appendix E, Materials Recovery, are intended to ensure that all environmental, health, and safety risks associated with materials recovery operations are adequately controlled and that FMs are properly managed until final disposition. And you've probably heard this before. For more information about the R2v3 standard, visit the R2 knowledge base on the SERI website.